The battle rages on the fields of Troy. Phalanxes of Greeks advance upon the Trojans. They parry and kill each other with throws of their spears. The blood runs heavily into the dust. Sarpedon, king of Lycia, son of the god Zeus and mortal Laodamia, leads his force to battle as an ally of the Trojans. He charges to the front, telling his friend Glaucus, "Now 1,000 shapes of fatal death confront us, which no mortal man can flee from or avoid. So let's go forward to give the glory to another man or win it for ourselves." His enemy, the Greek warrior Patroclus, dons the hero Achilles' armor and rushes onto the field with his fighters, the Myrmidons. Patroclus fights fiercely and kills all combatants in his path. Patroclus fights all the way to the gates of Troy and throws his spear directly into the heart of the noble Sarpedon. Sarpedon falls. Patroclus puts his foot on his chest, pulls out the spear, and blood and guts spill out upon the ground. Sarpedon claws at the dust, chokes, and groans as he dies. The spirit of Sarpedon then flies from his body. Zeus cannot spare his son. His fate has been sealed. Zeus calls the messenger god Hermes to collect his son's body, and the winged spirits of sleep and death carry off the naked body of Sarpedon, stripped of its armor. This is what you see in this remarkable vase. This passage from Homer's Iliad says much about the Greek love of honor, virtue, fighting, and their regard for fate and death. The Greek word arete, meaning virtue, honor, and bravery, is the quality that warriors and all Greeks strive for, being the best they can be. And the Greeks loved myths that involved conflict and the display of bravery and virtue in terrible conditions. Now, the story from the Iliad is a potent one. One thing it does is clearly dramatize the power of the Greek army in war. The Iliad also puts you right in the thick of warfare, so you actually sense the violence and the meaninglessness of so much death. We just finished looking at a cycle of mythical battles, the metapiece of the Parthenon, which not only illustrated the myths, but glorified the whole idea of battle itself. The nobility of the Greeks, their virtues, and their superiority were all being shown in the art. In fact, the Greeks were some of the best in the world at using mythical allegory to promote themselves. They did it in sculpture, and as we saw on the Parthenon, they did it on a grand scale. But they also did it on a smaller, much more intimate scale, in objects like this, their vases. So it's no surprise that mythical war and warriors play such a big role in Greek art. But along with war, inevitably comes death, and that has to be dealt with as well. Death is a dramatic and noble subject for art. It also evokes strong emotions, of course. This illustration of the death of Sarpedon in battle is one of the greatest versions of this scene from the Iliad. It also transcends its medium to become a masterpiece of ancient painting. So what exactly makes it more than just an illustration of warfare and a fallen soldier? When you look at this closely, you can actually feel the sadness and the poignancy of the transformation of a youthful, noble warrior with a perfect male form into a heavy corpse being carried off the battlefield. Blood runs diagonally leftward from his wounds as he is carried off to the right. His fingers curl limply with loss of the life force. His body forms a strong horizontal, cutting across the form of Hermes, the Greek messenger god, who was able to conduct souls to the afterlife. The composition is really skilled. It's not so easy to show a dead body being carried, and it's even harder to show on this type of medium, a round ceramic pot painted in only 2 colors. Sculpture was not the only means of artistic expression in Greece. They practiced painting too. While we have almost no surviving wall painting, we do have thousands of painted Greek vases. That's partly because pottery is virtually indestructible, and these pots continue to be valued long afterwards by other cultures. In fact, painted pottery achieved one of the highest peaks of Greek archaic and classical artistic expression. We looked at what's called the High Classical period through the lens of the Parthenon sculptures in the last lecture, but this time we're going back in time, from the mid-4th century to the 6th century BC. We're looking at one of the great artworks from the same place, Attica, or the area around Athens. And we see on a much more intimate scale similar kinds of narratives to what we saw in the Parthenon, narratives of heroic battles, gods, and myths. Vase painting with its small areas is complex and stunning. It's a different approach to illustrating the stories of Greeks. Here's our Greek vase again. It was made sometime around 515 BC. We call this era the Archaic Age to distinguish it from the later Classical era, which started in 480 BC. We call the type of vase itself a calyx crater, and it's a rather large mixing bowl, 18 inches high, for mixing wine and water. That's how the Greeks drank their wine. So this would have been used at a symposium, essentially a dinner party. Look at how graceful and lively the shape itself is. It opens out elegantly like the flower it's named after, from a tiered foot widening to its greatest extent at the mouth. Even the handles are elegantly curved to echo the shape of the crater. This is the work of a master potter, and we even know his name because he signed it, Euxithios. We also know the name of the famous painter of this vase, Euphronios, who signed the pot too. He was well known, and we even have a rival of his who signs his own painting as never Euphronios, in other words, bragging that he was better than Euphronios, taunting him humorously. We have 20 surviving vases that Euphronios signed. While we're on the subject of this signature, this vase has a very interesting modern story to tell in addition to its ancient one. The vase was revealed with great fanfare at New York's Metropolitan Museum in 1972. I actually remember the fanfare because I was a high school intern in the Egyptian department shortly after the vase was acquired. Tom Hoving was the director then, and he was always after the newest acquisition. The museum director publicized the vase widely as a fabulous acquisition, the only complete work of the genius Euphronios to survive. The price of over $1 million was the highest ever paid for a Greek vase at the time. It was installed in its own room at the Met. However, shortly after its acquisition, art historians and others began to suspect that it hadn't been bought from an old Swiss collection, as claimed, but was freshly dug out of the ground, looted from Italy. So the media gave the vase a new name, the hot pot. There was a long, difficult diplomatic and legal battle. Looting of ancient sites was put under a spotlight. Photos found decades later of the fragments of the vase covered with mud showed for sure that the vase had been looted from a tomb. It was officially returned to Italy and has been on exhibition there since 2008. So, this pot is our first instance of looking at an actual signature of an artist. In ancient times in Mesopotamia and Egypt, most artists worked anonymously. There were groups of craftsmen, and they were rarely credited or named. Euphronios, on the other hand, was a master painter, and he was a pioneer in creating and using a new technique of painting. That technique that's used here is called red figure vase painting. This new technique, which came into use about 530 BC, turned out to have some advantages over the old way of painting vases, which was called black figure. You can see in this vase from Boston that the painter has tried an experiment, painting each side in a different technique. It's called bilingual. The picture shows Heracles prodding a bull onto its sacrifice. The two sides show how the new technique of red figure was essentially a reversal of the customary colors used in vase painting, which were black or red. Here's why they're different. In black figure vase painting, details were scratched out or incised into the black figures. In red figure, the details like muscles and hair could be painted more fluidly on the body. You could even dilute the paint in order to get the nuances of line and shading, which is exactly what Euphronios has done in this vase. The red bodies in the newer technique look more natural to us today, so we often prefer it, even though I think the black silhouette image is very elegant, even abstract in its spareness. Here's an illustration of how they did this kind of vase painting. Remember, greater skill was required to paint on a curving surface versus on one that was flat. So this is how it was done. Now, when you get right down to it, the most important aspect of a Greek vase was its picture. In most cases, the central picture featured human forms and told the story of myths featuring gods, heroes, and some animals. Greek vase painters did not really paint landscapes or architecture, so a sense of place for each story is quite minimal in vases. You have to concentrate on the narrative being told, and that story is often about war. Now, you might like to know more about what's happening on the vase and what makes it so special. This side depicts the scene from the Trojan War which I described earlier, the death of the hero Sarpedon as told by Homer in the Iliad. What you're seeing on this side of the vase is essentially a mythological scene, and you can tell right away because of the figures with wings that carry Sarpedon. Remember the winged genies from the Assyrian palaces? The Greek winged figures are forces or personification of states of being. In this case, we have sleep and death as brothers, and they are even labeled so. Euphronios seems to have taken great pride in being able to write. The winged beings were called by Zeus to soften the death of Sarpedon. The Assyrian winged genies are protective spirits, so in some senses, they're analogous. They protect and come to the rescue. And of course, we have the notion of gentle winged angels in the Bible and even today. Sleep and death are not just winged, they wear armor, and their helmets are pushed up onto the tops of their heads. Each bends down to gently grasp the legs and shoulders of Sarpedon. Their curving postures frame the scene, and their figures are shown in profile with foreshortened torsos. Their eyes are still shown the archaic way, just like the Egyptians, frontally. The wings of the figures present a subtle pattern, a diagonal frame, which completes the complex zigzag rhythm of their limbs and backs. In the center, behind the body of Sarpedon, stands Hermes. His face is angled down towards the figure of sleep, Hypnos. His left arm is upraised in a gesture expressing perhaps shock or disbelief. And in the other hand, he holds his staff and symbol, the caduceus. That staff is held at the same diagonal as the wings of death and the limp arm of Sarpedon. Hermes' beard even projects at this angle. The soft folds of his garments set off the nude body of the fallen soldier. Hermes wears his helmet with wings, and his dark, wavy hair forms a decorative pattern in itself. Note that his feet have him walking to the right, with the body and its transporters, but his head is turned to the left, making for a livelier scene. Now let's look closely at the body of Sarpedon. It's the most massive element of the composition on this vase, and the most important. It's in the foreground and horizontal. It embodies the words of the Iliad, in which Homer says that Sarpedon fell like a great oak cut down in the forest. Sarpedon's head is turned downward towards the earth, and his hair is of a lighter shade and thinner. His body is shown frontally, not in profile, and here's where Euphronios really was able to show his skill. Look at the way the muscles have been subtly painted in a diluted paint that depicts them as almost molded rather than outlined. The abdominal muscles form an oval pattern divided into 4 parts. The pelvic area is also accurately muscled, and the genitals are shown. The lower legs have lines that sketch in the boniness of the knees and shins, and the arms are muscled as well, but the foreshortened right arm drags the hand on the ground, while the left one rests on the ground to the right. The legs hang limp and in disarray. The spear wounds, 3 here, are near the heart, the lower abdomen, and the leg. They gush blood, shown in translucent, almost purple paint. They're depicted on the same diagonal line as the arm, the caduceus, and the bending figures. The blood indicates that the motion is to the right. So this pattern of diagonals has set up the scene in a way which dramatizes the motion. And it gives us a sense of urgency and alarm. The body, in many respects, is a translation into paint of what we saw earlier with the marble sculpture of Akouros. There are more figures here. 2 guards, dressed in full battle gear, look on as the body is spirited away. They add a sense of solidity and pathos to the scene. They can do nothing, and so stand still with their spears and their shields at rest. There's more to this story. Sarpedon, before he dies, has called out to Glaucus to keep his body. He doesn't want it to fall into the hands of the enemy, who will strip it of its armor. So he says, "You too, fight to keep my body, else in later days this day will be your shame. You'll hang your head all your life long if these Achaeans take my armor here." But of course, he's shown naked, so it appears as if they have gotten it after Patroclus has pulled out his spear, which killed him. What a bloody, depressing story. And not one that exactly glorifies war. It depicts it in a gory and disheartening manner. The toll is heavy, and it's ultimately almost pointless. Note that the stripping of armor is something that we've seen already and will continue to see in scenes of death due to warfare. It mostly implies the humiliation of the warrior in his defeat. The removal of his armor and clothing is the stripping of power, and the exposure of his pathetically defenseless human body, which is shown in chaotic disarray with wounds or just limp. Death and the ritualistic treatment of the body are very important in Greece, and in almost all ancient cultures, they seem to have been a prime subject for art. In fact, another of the most famous Greek vases shows exactly such a death scene, and this vase is in Boston. The dragging of Hector, as it's called, shows the scene right after the one we've been talking about in the Trojan War. This time, the man who killed Sarpedon, Patroclus, has in turn been killed by Hector. Achilles is enraged that his friend Patroclus has been killed, and so he kills Hector in revenge. But he doesn't stop there. He does something worse. He desecrates the body of Hector by dragging it around behind his chariot. This creates a huge scene of agony and sorrow until the body is relinquished to the family. Earlier than these vases were made, geometric pottery from Greece had served as grave markers. Many of those pots illustrated a lying in state of the body on a funeral couch. Funeral games, athletic competitions, were an important part of Greek ritual mourning, and they were often depicted, especially on the early pottery. So the way the body was treated after death had complex associations. It was tied up with honor, religion, and even political conflict in Greece, and in other places too. and the revealing of the defenseless body in nakedness and death is the scene with most pathos of all. So far, we've seen naked enemies trampled underfoot in the Palette of Narmer from Egypt, in the Standard of Ur from Mesopotamia, and we'll see it in the Americas with the Maya and the Moche. In fact, Moche pottery showing mano a mano battles has a very similar theme of combat, conquest, humiliation, and armor stripping, shown in a completely different style. It's interesting to see that in these two cultures so remote from one another, the same medium is used, painted pottery. We don't know, however, if the Moche were representing real battles or mythological ones. Unlike the Greek, there's no Moche writing to help us understand, but the mistreatment and humiliation of the body of the enemy seems to be an important part of this theme of combat. It's showing hegemony and power over other people and groups. We'll be looking at a Moche artifact in a later lecture, an earspool worn by a ruler, which gives us a sense of his power and weaponry. Representing grisly scenes of wounded, dead, tortured, and naked warriors in art was actually a good way of preventing more conflict from happening. The artworks had the power of prevention and intimidation. They gave the viewer some insight into the horrors of warfare. Scenes like these bring up the brute, visceral feelings of disgust at seeing blood and gore and limbs torn apart. It's hard to turn away from them and not feel affected. You can imagine that a rounded, bulbous, or flared pot wall may not have been the easiest place to paint such dramatic scenes. It presented all sorts of challenges, yet these artists figured out ways to solve them. Clay is the common material that most humans have used for millennia. Vases and pots were used daily by the Greeks for food, drink, and even as art. The English word ceramic actually comes from the Greek keramikos, which means pottery in general. Greek pots came in many shapes and sizes. Artists had to fit a coherent scene in between the handles, yet somehow link it to the other side in continuity with the shape. The artist has to solve this problem as well as try to tell a visually compelling story. That's done on Greek pottery by using a continuous frieze of decoration, a band that goes around the pot and ties it together. In this instance, Euphronios has used a very complex and pleasing palmette chain on the top. There's a bigger palmette and lotus decoration on the bottom. They set off the dramatic scene in the center and make it more decorative. On the other side of the pot, Euphronios has depicted a scene of a group of young men putting on their arms in preparation for war. It contrasts with the mythical scene on the front by showing what looks like a contemporary scene of warfare. It's not as much of a masterwork as the front, but it ties the theme in with something that the Greek citizens would have recognized. It made its point about war. Another aspect of pottery painting that I find very interesting is comparing it with what came earlier in Mesopotamia. I see the designs on some pots as they move in a narrative fashion around the vase to be similar to the idea of rolling a cylinder seal. We've seen that registers were used in Mesopotamian art, as in the Assyrian reliefs, and rolled out the narrative action. With actual cylinder seals, you were rolling the design into the clay, and you could easily impress upon a pot a scene of action or decoration without beginning or end. So the Greek notion of narrative in scenes of this nature has a forerunner in Mesopotamia. Similarly, cylinder seals showing the combat scenes of nude heroes grappling with lions foreshadow Heracles in Greece. Heracles is a very popular subject for Greek vase paintings, and he is shown here pressing down upon and actually wrestling the Nemean lion. This lion scene was the first and most popular scene of the Herculean labors. The lion couldn't be killed by any weapons, so Heracles had to use his bare hands and great strength to overcome it. Now look at the very similar sort of scene that comes 2,000 years before it. You can see that heroic endeavors, whether they involve fighting man or beast, are a frequent and important subject for art. Because after all, these artworks encourage the people of each state to be brave, to serve the armies of the state, and to cultivate physical strength and courage. It's a sort of propaganda. At the same time, overcoming lions and appearing powerful in warfare reassured people who were anxious and living in a time of uncertain survival and difficult conditions that we can only imagine. One last comparison with Euphronius' masterpiece bears looking at. This Douris vase painting of the death of Memnon. Here Eos, the goddess of dawn, cradles the limp dead body of her son. The painting from 490 BC has all the pathos of Euphronios Sarpedon, although it's much simpler. While it's not as complex and sophisticated in composition as Sarpedon, it still beautifully conveys the sorrow and agony of a mother upon the death of her son. The body of Memnon lies horizontally, just like Sarpedon's. In fact, Douris worked with Euphronios early in his career. So this manner of representing death goes on to be used by others and to warn them of the futility of war, the finality of death, and the beauty of art that can convey the sorrow.